We are now getting ready for our last session, an important one at that, on climate change and what it means for us here in Illinois. Featuring experts in the field, and we're honored to have with us today State Representative Ann Williams of the 11th District, Joel Bramier, Executive Director, Alliance for the Great Lakes, Kyra Woods, Policy Advisor on Climate for the Mayor and City of Chicago, and Dr. Trent Ford, Illinois State Climatologist, UIUC. And moderating the discussion is Brett Chase, Chicago Sun-Times environmental reporter, has formerly worked for Better Government Association as investigative reporter, as well as other publications, Bloomberg News, Milwaukee, Centennial Journal, and Cranes. Welcome, Brett, and welcome everyone today. Glad you could be with us. And Brett, you can start whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks. Well, we've got a great panel today. I'm going to ask each panelist to just make a short introduction, tell you who they are, and a little bit about their focus, their individual focus on climate. And I'm going to start with Joel Bramier, who's the CEO of the advocacy organization Alliance for the Great Lakes. Joel, do you want to just start us off?
Sure. I'll kick things off with just a few points about how we see climate change impacting the Great Lakes in a way that I think has major implications for the built environment. So number one, I think that what everybody sees most visibly are these extreme changes in water levels. And water level changes in the Great Lakes are a natural phenomenon, but we're seeing the rise, the move between the extremes of low and high to be really accelerated. And that's been very obvious in the Chicago area, where you've seen a record low jump to a record high in the span of less than a decade. And so that's concerning because it has big impacts on coastal infrastructure, whether it's public or private. And so that's one thing that we're watching closely in terms of climate change impacts. Another one, I think more broadly than that, though, is the extreme rainfalls that we see that are part of what feeds that water level cycle. And in the Great Lakes region, these extreme storms are just overwhelming built water infrastructure systems in cities across northeastern Illinois and across the Great Lakes region, where you've seen record rainfalls in multiple years over the last 5 in multiple states across the region. You've had people being, 10,000 people being flooded out of their homes in mid-Michigan. You've had extreme damage to home and business property in Detroit and here in Chicago. And those extreme rainfalls are having a big impact, not just on the Great Lakes themselves, but on the communities that depend on them. And the third thing I draw everybody's attention to is the impact that all that water has on the pollution that actually is going into the lakes themselves. So one of the main ways that our Great Lakes get dirty is as a result of water running off the surface. And so these extreme storms are pushing pollutants from agriculture, pollution from cities into the lakes in a way that really is unprecedented. And in the long run, what that means is we're going to be, if we don't make changes towards a more resilient infrastructure framework, we're actually going to be pushing more and more pollution into the water for a whole variety of reasons and in a whole variety of ways. And that's got the implication, I think, over decades that I'm most concerned about, which is that cities and communities that aren't resilient to these extreme rainfalls could end up being places that are polluting our Great Lakes that we all rely on. So I'll pause there, Brett, and we can come back to some of those points later on.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I definitely want to come back to you on some of the planning aspects, and then we could talk about that report you put out earlier this year. Let's go to Trent Ford. It's been just an invaluable resource for me. Anytime I'm working on anything climate related, I call our state climatologist, Trent Ford. And why don't you start out, just explain real quick what a state climatologist does, and then maybe you can tell us about some of the eye-opening data that I know that you have there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brett. Yeah, so my name is Trent Ford. I'm the Illinois State Climatologist based at the State Water Survey at the University of Illinois here in Champaign. And yeah, my position is a good amount of research. So I'm a climate scientist, a climatologist by trade, and I do original research, especially with extremes like drought, extreme heat, flooding, things like that. But then also a significant part of my job is outreach. presentations like this, for example, and communication with communities, with state agencies, with state officials about what is going on, not just with climate change, with climate variability, climate extremes, what to look out for. And yeah, as Brett, as you mentioned, I have lots of statistics under my hands to work with. And, I mean, we can really summarize broadly climate change in Illinois over the last 50 years and really looking at projections into the next 70 to 80 years is something similar to the previous speaker, the senator from Pennsylvania, mentioning is just getting warmer and wetter. And some of these impacts that Joel mentioned are really coming down from that. For example, last year, so the city of Chicago set its record total May rainfall 3 years in a row, 2018, 19, and then 2020. In May 2020, the city of Chicago got 7.8 inches of rain in 4 days. Now thinking about the impact that has on urban flooding, stormwater drainage, sewage drainage, things like that. Often we think about our built environment built to the 100-year rainfall event, for example. So the estimated recurrence interval of that event back in May of last year that caused all that flooding, including flooding and power outage in the Willis Tower, based on 2019 estimates of the recurrence interval, that's a 1 in 25-year event. So a 4% chance of happening any given year. That compares to a 1 in 50-year event, a 2% chance of happening any given year, just based on 1989 estimates. So 30 years of more recent data increases the risk of that sort of event happening twofold just in the last 30 years. So it's a really significant increase in precipitation intensity. Something that wasn't mentioned before is also extreme heat. Over the last 30 years, for example, Chicago, the city of Chicago and Northern Illinois in general has averaged about 2 to 3 days per year with a high temperature exceeding 95 degrees. Projections under the moderate scenario, which we can discuss climate change scenarios if we want to, and the likelihood of reaching those or not. The moderate scenario shows increasing the number of extreme days that Northern Illinois will experience between 8 and 20 95-degree days by mid-century, that's 2050. Just as a reminder, that's less than 30 years away. And between 15 and 60 95-plus degree days by late century. So we're talking an additional possible 2 months of 95-degree days by the end of the century under the moderate scenario. So really talking about wetter, hotter, and of course, we can discuss all the impacts from that during the session. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Next panelist, Kyra Woods, somebody I've known since her days as in the advocacy world. She's now a policy advisor for the city of Chicago and Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Kyra, you want to catch us up on what's going on in the city of Chicago?
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction. And it's really an honor to be here and join AIA Illinois. Again, my name is Kyra Woods and happy to join you from the mayor's office here. Before had the pleasure of really trying to work with a number of these different initiatives just from a different angle. And it's really exciting to be able to see them to the next level. Actually, just last week, we passed a pretty historic budget here in Chicago that is looking to provide one of the largest single investment towards climate investments here in the city. We're talking about $188 million towards initiatives that are going to get at green infrastructure, energy and equity considerations, deliberately expanding the tree canopy and really trying to do that in a way that prioritizes economic and racial equity as we think about the types of partners we can have and what areas don't have that type of tree coverage yet. And then also really deliberately thinking about investments towards community and environmental justice initiatives. So holistically, we're, as I mentioned, $188 million into these 4 categories allows us to think about not only mitigation strategies and tactics, but also that social cohesion and resilience that is necessary, not only to weather the storm through 2050, as Dr. Ford just mentioned, but even thinking about the generations that will be here beyond that time frame and the changing climate and communities that we will have in that span. Also, earlier this year, we put forward our green recovery agenda, which really revolves around 4 primary pieces. Definitely our climate action plan, which we are very, very much looking forward to advancing and getting some more community input around. In 2008, the city put together its first climate action plan and its first climate goals. In 2015, or really in 2012, we came together again to reevaluate some of those strategies. And it's about time to do that again. So we are proud to be a part of the C40 network, an international network of other cities, really trying to say, how can we, again, not just get at mitigation tactics to reduce our carbon imprint and our carbon footprint, but also how can we provide the resources and support for resilient communities and the adaptation that's necessary. The second part of our green recovery agenda deliberately looks at our buildings as one of our greatest sources of emissions, and trying to explore strategies and policies around building decarbonization efforts. The third and fourth actually relate to energy, but in pretty big ways. In 2017, Mary Manuel committed to move all municipal power purchase to a clean and renewable portfolio by 2025. And in 2019, City Council voted to do that for our community-wide electricity needs. And so we are continuing to explore how we can use our franchise agreement to explore how to do that in an equitable way. And then also we're making some substantial progress also in that journey towards 100% municipally clean power also this year too. So that's a snapshot, and look forward to talking more.
Before I let you guys, when we talk about climate change, you're talking about mitigation and adaptation, and I hear you talking about both. I mean, would you say the city spends more on one versus the other?
I think the history of this conversation has really lent itself to a lot of mitigation conversation, even academically, and advocacy has really leaned into that space. But I think residents have long been aware that the conversation also needs to be about adaptation. And we are definitely at a place within this climate journey that you can't talk about climate change without really getting to that adaptation and resiliency need. Because we're seeing it. And even in Chicago, while we may not have the fires and the storms in the same way that some of our coastal cities do, we're experiencing those changes.
We'll talk more about that. And I think this is an audience that probably is really keenly interested in that. Thank you. All right, so State Representative Ann Williams, just one of the most instrumental legislators in the passage of a major climate legislation this year, the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Is Representative Williams with us, or?
I'm here. I'm here.
Hi.
Hi, Brent. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Brent, and Stacy for including me in this panel. When I was working on the climate bill for the past 3 years, by the end, I didn't want to talk or think about it anymore. And now that it's passed, it seems all I do is talk and think about it, but that's in a positive way. So just about a month ago, the Illinois GA advanced our transition to clean energy by finally, after years of effort, approving what I would call a comprehensive nation-leading climate bill. And the focus really was on communities and consumers, unlike previous iterations of comprehensive energy packages. If you have been following Illinois, you understand what I'm referring to there. So the bill is 1,000 pages long, and it does a lot of things. Very comprehensive. We preserve our nuclear fleet as a bridge to the development of renewable energy. We invest significantly in renewable energy sources. We focus on equitable jobs, job training, just transition in coal communities. And we, very importantly, provide a strong foundation of utility accountability and oversight measures. And the issue of equity and including communities traditionally left behind is really a thread that goes throughout the bill. So I first introduced the Clean Energy Jobs Act, acronym CEJA, in spring of 2019. Over the course of the next 2 years, it evolved to be the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, conveniently the same acronym, but really the name I prefer, the final name, because we really did focus on climate and equity in terms of what the final package looked like. During that time, and even before introduction of the bill, a group called the Clean Jobs Coalition, made up of faith leaders, advocacy organizations, environmental organizations, wind and solar developers, traveled throughout the state on what they called a listen, lead, share tour to talk to communities around the state and really ask what they'd like their clean energy future to look like. Of course, as these conversations were taking place, we are seeing the climate crisis rapidly escalate. So the conversation about climate became more and more important over time and more relevant to people over time. So the bill finally passed after months of very intense and challenging negotiations. We had working groups, we had panels, we had subject matter hearings, we had legislative hearings, we had any number of versions of the bill. But at the end of the day, while no bill was perfect, I really did feel that we struck the right balance at the right time with the passage of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So many of the priorities we talked about initially with communities throughout Illinois were incorporated in the final package. And the big important piece to focus on, I think, today is, throughout the conversation, there was a lot of interest in renewable and solar development, wind development in Illinois. But the issue of decarbonization was, strangely, for a blue state, hard fought. We did not put that while a number of us had that at the forefront of our legislative agendas, making sure that we put decarbonization, a strong, concrete decarbonization program in the bill. That was something that we really struggled with colleagues and interest groups and other stakeholders over the past few months. But finally, it came together. And for the first time, we have a solid decarbonization plan for Illinois. We ensure a complete and just transition from fossil fuel power generations to renewable energy by having a carbon-free power sector by 2045, with significant coal and gas plant closures leading up to that date. Sounds obvious, sounds like a no-brainer, but it really wasn't. It was really hard fought. At one point during negotiations, I think late May or sometime in early summer, 40 plus legislators, including myself, sent a letter to stakeholders and legislative leaders and said, without equity, without climate in the bill, we are not going to strike a deal. And we were prepared to walk away if there were not strong decarbonization measures included in the bill. So despite a lot of ups and downs and quite a roller coaster ride, we did end up with what I think is a real winner for Illinois. And of course, the thing, unlike most bills that you pass in Springfield, you can't check that box, feel good, and move on. This is a drop in the bucket when it comes to what we need to do locally, nationally, globally, of course, to address climate change. But we did what we could, and we'll continue to do what we can to continue to address the issue. One thing we're doing a little differently than we have in the past, energy bills in the past were often negotiated literally in the back rooms of the utility companies. That didn't happen this time. It was a legislative driven process. And this time we're going to be monitoring the implementation and continuing the conversation even after passage. My committee, which is the Energy and Environment Committee, will be having periodic updates about implementation. As we speak, committees are being formed and work is being done to implement the provisions of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So when my colleagues or stakeholders or citizens or residents or business people want to say, well, what did you guys do in that 1,000-page bill? Is it really working? We can hopefully have an answer to that question all along the way. And if it's not working as intended, if we're not seeing the results that we wanted to see in terms of equity or in terms of mitigating the fossil fuel emissions as we planned, we will be able to revisit it kind of in real time. So I feel very optimistic about our approach here. I feel less optimistic sometimes about where we're going as a planet, but that's why this conversation is so important. And I look forward to being a part of it. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for clarifying the final name of that too. The old name, but yeah, it really the equity part of it was really, really stands out here. And Illinois was also the first in the Midwest to have these sort of ambitious goals for being carbon free. Let me throw out a question for the whole group, and just kind of keep in mind who our audience is here. Architects, but people that are obviously going to be very interested in planning, building, design. What are some of the things we need to keep in mind as we prepare for the future? And let's just I'll throw it out to the group. Whoever wants to take it first. Joel, you want to get us started?
Sure. I'll jump in. So on that focus, Brett, I would say think about the challenge that Northeastern Illinois has with managing water once it hits the ground. I think a lot of people here in this conference are probably very kind of steeped in the history of projects like the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, which is this massive deep tunnel and reservoir system that's supposed to move water off the land and into these big pits in the ground and eventually be cleaned by sewage treatment plants. We know that, for example, those kinds of approaches are necessary but far from sufficient for the kinds of rain events that Northeastern Illinois is going to be facing in the coming decades, and as we've already heard, is already facing, right? So when I think about what to where to keep your eye right now when it comes to building design and site design, I'm thinking about how do we actually increase the amount of water that's being managed in a way that keeps the residents and businesses adjacent to those buildings healthy and preserves their property. Not to mention, keeps more pollution out of a place like Lake Michigan. And the reality is that even when these big kind of these 20th century massive gray infrastructure projects that were conceived and really are at the tail end of 50 years of work, they're really not up to the task of managing the kind of rainfall and storm events that we're going to be seeing more and more over the coming decades. What else are we going to do? How are we going to stop sewage overflows from continuing to follow our waterways? How are we going to make sure that we really are building with nature in a way that protects people's homes and properties and health from the impacts of these extreme rainfalls? That's really at the forefront of my mind. A big challenge there is that a lot of the work that needs to be done has to happen on land that's already been developed. We're not just talking about places that are undergoing new development, but we're talking about big water stresses on parts of northeastern Illinois and the city of Chicago that are already highly developed and have a lot of hard surfaces right now. Undoing some of that and figuring out how to bring nature into those places to deal with this water challenge is going to be a big job.
I can pipe in a little bit just with a situation that I recently learned about through a friend. So, a lot of our building codes and our municipal codes related to zoning were not passed or implemented with climate issues in mind. I have a friend, a suburb to be unnamed, who was trying to put solar panels on her home, and she called me panicking because the design that she could afford had panels where the sun was best, and that was on the front of her home, and the building code provided for panels. Apparently they're unsightly according to that municipality, so they're only allowed on the backside of her home. That makes absolutely no sense. It's not consistent with what our goals are. We put all this time and effort into doing all these things, and then someone who wants to use solar can't because of a kind of an outdated code. So that's a little thing, but that can add up to a big thing. And I think our charge and your charge in the industry that you're in is to always be mindful and keep top of mind. What can I do? Where are there out of date or antiquated policies, codes, procedures, protocols that really don't make sense in our very quickly changing climate? I know that there is one piece of the bill that might be of interest to you in the energy efficiency portion. It provides for the Capital Development Board to develop a stretch energy code, which allows municipalities to develop a stronger energy efficiency requirement for local projects. So that's a little unusual. Normally we say you can't go higher than the state, but more strict than the state, but here we allow an opportunity for municipalities to do more. So I think just keeping in mind, where are there places we can make change? Can we go to that village board and talk to them about making a change there, for example?
I can offer a suggestion as well. Two things immediately come to mind. One is that we are no longer in a space where green is niche, and green is only for those residents who think that it is a great design. They saw it in a magazine or were inspired by, because everybody on their block may be doing it. I think we are in a place now where we really are trying to shift the tide and have these proof of concepts in a host of areas and very diverse areas as well. And so as I think about that synergy between our designers as well as the real estate agents, and the influence that you can have actually on a client or on a community as we try to model and show that this is possible, that not only can solar panels be a part of this design, but also as we think about the landscaping and how we position a building to have some of those more energy efficient measures, right? And thinking about nature-based solutions, even as a part of that, not just for the sake of bringing calm and well-being, because we know that there are some themes there, but also, the type of shading that it provides or the type of insulation that it may provide, depending on the type of tree and where it's positioned around the building and things like that. So I'm really, really interested in seeing how creative we can get as we not only build new buildings and new homes or new buildings, but as we retrofit as well, and as we reinvest in communities, which I know is a commitment from this administration time and time again. How can we reinvest in those neighborhoods that have been not just underinvested, but truly where investments have been pulled from? So as we're bringing that new life and new energy and new capital to spaces, let's leapfrog, right? And really be at the forefront of what is needed to weather this transition, and to be a part of this transition and be actively involved in taking Chicago and the state to the next level. The second piece that also comes to mind, I actually, in the interest of time, I'll lead with that one and share that in case Dr. Ford wants to say something.
Yeah, I do want to follow up real quick though. Like, I know that the city has got, multiple planning efforts, as it always does. It's a big city, but I mean, I think of like the
pretty big
industrial corridor modernization. That's under review again. We've got there's a pretty comprehensive plan overall.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're being consulted on this, and Angela.
We will Chicago.
Yeah. So what? How is climate justice, these sort of things factoring in as we're doing broader planning in the city of Chicago?
Yeah, We Will Chicago is a pretty fascinating undertaking in that it's being led by our planning department and truly trying to advance a comprehensive plan, a process we haven't undertaken in also quite a long time. So you're right, this is a moment where a lot of different planning efforts are underway. With that in mind, it's really exciting that climate and environment they're together. They comprise of a pillar of this total strategy that's being considered and being built out. So gratefully, we are working in conjunction with a diverse set of community leaders, some who've been very actively involved in previous planning efforts, and some who are truly newer to the table to say, what could this look like? And not just right now, but as we plan for the next few decades, what are the types of decisions that we need the city to be making to ensure that we will have a more just, a more transparent, a more equitable future. And so I think I know that there is a paradigm that is in use here that really seeks to acknowledge and have a historical reckoning of sorts, and that's necessary, I think, in each of the pillar categories. But to your point around climate justice and environmental justice, that's loaded. And so how can we both recognize some of those pieces that need to be addressed and healed as a way to also put forward a vision and something truly aspirational as well. But I think there is a link up, because there are some systems that truly don't work, as Rick Williams shared, and then there are some ambitious things that we know we need to get to, understanding some of the science that is before us.
Okay, and Trent, I hope, thank you. And Trent, I hope planners are talking to you, at least asking, for your data and even your thoughts on.
Yeah, I think it is, in working with planners more and more, especially when it comes to hazard mitigation plans or climate action plans, and and the making sure there's a lot of weather and climate data of it. I mean, that, Brett, when I send you way too much data when you ask for much less than what I send you. And and so translating that information to make it usable for development, for planning, for architecture is really important. One going back to your original question though, one point I wanted to make was that these buildings, development, infrastructure are often touted as a solution, either mitigation of the actual problem or adaptation to it, which is important. But we also have to think that these solutions through architecture and infrastructure development also have to themselves be resilient to changes in climate in the future. And Representative Williams mentioned that a lot of these building codes, stormwater drainage systems, these sorts of infrastructure weren't built to what we have now. But they also weren't built to a non-stationary climate, and that's what we have now. And so when we think about, for example, green infrastructure, trying to plant trees, well, the lifetime of a tree is hopefully 50, 70, 100 years. And so when we plant a tree in Chicago or any rural areas of Illinois as well, thinking about our wetter, warmer, but also more variable climate, we want to make sure that we're planting the trees, we're building the infrastructure that can be resilient to not just the climate today, but the future climate. 'Cause we plant a bunch of trees that aren't drought tolerant. We see, more summertime drought. They're not going to provide the services we want them to provide. So that's also important to understand, is building not just for today's climate, but the climate change that we're going to see over the lifetime of that infrastructure.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so my reporting has shown like entire neighborhoods just being, wiped out because they're just no more, they're just not inhabitable anymore. There's just too much flooding. Which leads me to another question just for the group. I've dropped this term climate justice, but environmental justice, it's like they're related. I mean, the folks that bear the brunt of pollution and also the effects that we're seeing on climate. Communities, low income communities of color often. Talk a little bit about that in terms of this for the group, just planning and reuses of particular areas of the city and the state and the Midwest. Whoever wants to tackle that one.
Well, I can start, and I was thinking about this as there was a conversation going about the Industrial Corridor Modernization Initiative, and across, I think, in the Great Lakes world, there is definitely a tendency to have conversations about what does future Great Lakes resilience look like? How might this region become a refuge for people moving around North America, right? That's a very common conversation, and it's fair to have it, but I also try to bring that back to a resilient Great Lakes for the future is one that is resilient now, right? And so if we are talking about building resilient communities, Great Lakes communities that can be resilient to the future impacts of climate change, we'd be well served to look to the communities that are lacking resilience now, that are brittle now, right? And as I'm thinking about the question about the industrial corridors, there's an opportunity to look at what are the breakdowns that led to kind of breaks with nature in that area, viewing nature as something that was kind of built upon and became kind of taken out of service. And how do we turn that around? How do we actually take that kind of experience over several decades or even longer, and actually turn it into one that says, this is what we're going to do. These are the steps we're going to take to actually, So Brett, when you talk about, I hope that recording cut wasn't I did. Brett, when you talk about climate justice, or the intersection of climate resilience and environmental justice, I'm thinking about things like places that are, communities that are experiencing, the overburden of flood damage, community, and how that intersects with carbon intensive industries, how that intersects with a tendency to still have things like high carbon industries and pollution permit violations, and all concentrated in these same places, right? And so while we have to make our places that are stable more resilient, that is true, we also have a long way to go to bring communities that have experienced the brunt of that brittleness with nature back to a place where they are welcoming for people who live there now and for people who might live there in the future. I'll pause there. I'm sure others have more to say about that.
I think I'd like to pipe in and just talk about really the nexus between, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the nexus between the disparities in healthcare and health outcomes and public health, and the same communities have been disproportionately impacted by pollution. There is a nexus, it's a clear nexus. And when we were pushing and fighting for the decarbonization program, we were talking about coal plants that were in the middle of primarily low-income communities and communities of color. And yet those are the ones that were almost left out of the bill. So we still need to remind and highlight and focus people on the fact that those communities are traditionally left behind in many, many areas. And that nexus of public health beyond the pandemic, but the asthma rates, the exposure to lead, it's all the same communities that are hit hardest. So that is one of the motivations for threading throughout the bill, a focus on those communities. But one affirmative thing we've done, well, several affirmative things we've done in the bill, is to ensure that those same communities who have been disproportionately impacted by pollution now get their share of the benefits of the clean energy economy. So we are doing things like requiring reporting for renewable energy projects as new projects come online, not just mandated goals for the whole industry, but project by project goals. We want to and are dedicating a portion of projects solely to projects constructed by minority-owned businesses. There's job training modules, things like that, but we want ownership to lie with underserved communities and people of color, because traditionally they don't have 3 or 4 generations of family that have been involved in the construction industry. It's not easy to jump in that industry, the tools, the experience. So those are things we really want to amplify. So we have a lot of serious targets on companies that are going to be in the space, and funding mechanisms, because you can't grow a business without funding. We have a green bank for accessible capital and a loan and grant program also for seed funding. So we're looking to reduce barriers for new and growing minority-owned businesses. And that was a hard fought, because trying to balance that with some of the requirements for strong, strong wages and strong benefits that the labor unions wanted to see, we definitely had to find a balance there. But at the end of the day, we were, I think, able to do so. But that was a critical piece. And no matter which part of the bill you're looking at, of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Bill, we have something in there for those communities, the populations traditionally left behind. It's really, I think I described it at the beginning as a thread throughout the bill, and I expect we'll continue to see that as we further modify and tweak our energy conversations in the coming months and years.
Thanks. Kyra, Trent, any thoughts? Okay. We do want to reserve a few minutes for Q&A from the audience. I don't know how we want to do this. If you want to put your questions in chat or raise your hand. This is where maybe I ask the folks at AIA for help.
Hey Brett, this is Fred. How are you? Thank you for chairing the panel, and what a great group of panelists that we have. Quick question for the group. And Joel, you started talking about it. I'd be interested to hear Trent and everyone's comment on the notion of climate migration. We touched a little bit about updating and improving our current systems for current weather events that are going to be taking place, but what happens in 50 years when portions of the country start coming towards the Midwest because of water needs and everything else that comes with that, as far as housing and social programs and infrastructure systems? Any comment on that? And Trent, you got any quick stats on that notion?
Just real quick, I don't have any specific stats, but I have seen research that has shown that migration from, maybe we can call them climate change hotspots in the US, along the coast where we have intensifying tropical cyclones, and in the West with wildfires and drought, water availability, that increasingly the reason for the primary reason for migration is the climate, it's weather hazards. That's something that we actually saw the opposite of over the last 30 years. People were moving out of the Northeast, the Midwest, into these more climate change hotspots. And so any projections are showing that to continue and intensify in the next few decades as these hazards continue to intensify. So that is something, your point is well taken, that is something that the research backs up, that this is going to be an ever increasing challenge, both to places where people are moving out of and places where people are moving in.
Right. Especially water, right? In the Southwest is running out of water. We've got all the water here in the Midwest, right? So thank you.
We do have a question in the Q&A here. It says, any suggestion, this is for the whole group, any suggestions for how to talk to home and small business owners about climate change and their individual responsibility to help mitigate them?
I can chime in, or at least get us started. I have found that burdening homeowners and small business owners sometimes with the responsibility to address climate change can feel pretty daunting, and particularly in this age of recovery through the pandemic and some of the other kind of topsy-turvy economic situations that some families and communities found themselves under, climate change isn't necessarily the initial thing that people think they're responsible for, especially as we talk about it in such a global sense. I do feel as if some residents and small business owners are receptive to learning about what programs exist that help them. I think no matter like where you are, people appreciate a free thing, whether it's a free t-shirt or something like understanding how you can get your solar installation for, $0 up front, or understanding like pay as you save models. So I really do think that there is a conversation and something around like, honestly, building the conversation in spaces with people to understand like the range of opportunities and investments that can make. I think also it becomes really heavy when you think that you have to, sticking at least in this vein of solar panels or heat pumps, right? All the conversations and elements around electrification. If you think that you have to do all of that at once, who has the money to do that except for a particular sector of our population, right? Most people don't. And so I think it is easier to understand the smaller approaches, right? This is what ComEd or your local utility may be providing for free for you. You can get this energy audit. And after you do that, we would love to talk to you about some of the next steps and really fostering those relationships for those types of long-term trends and changes overall, right? And then it's through building those types of relationships, and whether it's with an architectural firm or with an anchor institution, maybe in the community, and doing some demonstration projects, that at least allows the space for people to see themselves as a part of the change and not necessarily solely responsible for the change, particularly because the entities of this question, right? It's homeowners or residents, tenants, or small business owners aren't truly responsible for getting us to this place in terms of the gravity of this situation. So I think that would be the first thing I offer around relationship building and really investing in some community level demonstration projects and pathways to change together.
We have a couple more questions here. Someone says, I live in Southwest Michigan. Can we work together with Illinois to deal with Lake Michigan and erosion? Anyone want to tackle that?
I'll give it a shot. I want to really amplify the point about community-based solutions on that previous question, though. I have seen this is on the water side, where you have communities, even down to the block level, where people are talking about the use of, for example, green stormwater infrastructure, and then you're building that conversation. There is an opportunity then to implement that at a scale that goes across multiple properties. But that really depends on that community level conversation, the will to do that. On the erosion issue, this is a real challenge, because most erosion control projects for private property are happening on a site-by-site basis, 100 feet at a time. It's not a recipe for a resilient shoreline. And so what we would love to see, my organization and some others that we talked to, one, I'll share that there is a major federal study happening called the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study, being run by the Army Corps of Engineers, that's looking at places within the Great Lakes region where you can build more resilient shorelines at scale, where those opportunities exist. So check into that. But at the state level and even locally, it's really about working together is really about getting groups of public and private property owners together to actually talk about what could be done across property lines, and whether investment and action together could actually create coastal protection that's more resilient, working more with nature than probably what could be accomplished on the individual side. There is going to be a lot of, I think, there's going to be a lot of federal money flowing into this area soon. There is I believe it is a $6 billion new coastal authorization coming down in the reconciliation package, if that passes. This is going to be something that's national, but it will have a big impact on the Great Lakes. So there will be a lot of funds coming into this area. And I think the question about how to do this collaboratively, across property lines is really, really critical.
Brent, what came to mind in the last two speakers that talked people want to do the right thing. They want to help. They can see this disaster unfolding and they want to take steps to make it better. If nothing else, the youth and their children are demanding nothing less. We had a huge group of youth activists throughout the process of passing this bill that were super engaged and pushing us as adults, and quite frankly, disappointed with what they felt was a lackluster response to this huge issue that really impacted their future. So people want to do the right thing. Our role as government, I think, and professionals working in the space is to make it easy for people to do that. I know one thing that I keep hearing about, and Joel, tell me if thumbs up or thumbs down, is when it's raining, don't run the dishwasher, don't do your laundry. And now I don't. And I tell all my friends not to too. I don't, so that's something new that we're just kind of getting accustomed to. Another thing, I live in the 47th ward, and there's an amazing group of people that decided there has got to be some place to recycle almost everything. So they've done a pop-up right here in the North Center Town Square, down the street from where I live, and they take everything and they figure out what to do with it. This poor woman has her basement and garage filled with other people's stuff, looking to find ways to recycle. And she has determined there are ways to reuse and recycle almost everything. But why should she have to take her time and her garage space to do that? We should be making that happen. So there are people out there wanting to do the right thing. We just need to make it easier and educate people on how to do that.
Okay, there's another question about how we're all working at home and whether the reductions of commutes having an effect on carbon or climate change. I mean, I can speak as a Chicagoan who occasionally has to venture on the road, and it seems like traffic is back. And I know that the public transit is actually taking a hit. But anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. So specifically, yeah, carbon emissions has bounced back since 2020. Transportation has too. I think the only one that hasn't really is emissions from air travel, because there's still less air travel than there has been. But yeah, I think to the larger point though, that what I think the last year could show us is that some substantial changes that could be made don't have necessarily the large negative impact that we may perceive them to have. And so working from home at first for me seemed like it was really not fun. And now on a hybrid situation, this is actually kind of nice. And so, the larger impact to carbon though is really the retransformation of transportation systems, EVs and public transit, accessible public transit, both in urban and rural areas. That's how we really take the carbon notch down in transportation.
Yeah, and actually transportation emissions overtook the energy sector several years ago. I wrote that story at my last employer. Actually, Representative, Representative Williams, is that going to be sort of next part of, clean energy legislation is addressing, and I know the transportation was addressed to a certain extent, but, there's obviously more to do.
Well, we just passed the REV Act, Reimagine Electric Vehicles, in the veto session just last week. And that bill kind of contemplates, on top of what we did with CEJA, electrifying the transportation sector in kind of three ways. First of all, rebates and incentives for individual users to purchase and utilize electric vehicles, fleet vehicles, personal vehicles, et cetera. Second, to ask utilities and require utilities to make the investments to facilitate broader use of electric vehicles. And then finally, for corporations to land here. One of the governor's primary goals at the summit this week is to sell. He's going to stop in London apparently on the way to Glasgow, and try and sell Illinois as the place to locate your EV business. And I saw him Monday, he left, I think Tuesday, and he is very excited about that. And with the passage of all these bills, we think we can be pretty much an inviting place for these businesses. We're centrally located. We have a relatively stable climate situation right now, relatively, as we've said on this call. And, we're working hard to make sure that the financial incentives are here too. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say the next step, but it's kind of a supplement and enhancement of what we did with the clean energy bill.
Well, it is 5 o'clock, and we're going to need to stop. But thanks to the panelists, and thanks for all the good questions. And let's all do our part.
Yeah, thank you, Brett, again, and what a wealth of knowledge and talent across the panelists. Thank you. 45 minutes plus of chock full of knowledge and information. So thank you very much.